This one will make you think. In places where free speech isn't as protected under the law, can comedy really take the liberty it needs to fly? You're about to find out the answer to that question in this timeless rebuttal by Konstantin Kisin to the BBC. This happened when British comedian Joe Brand's dark humor on BBC Radio treaded very close to incitement of violence under British law, which I think reveals the legal lines that the country draws to limit free speech for other subjectively defined virtues. There's a lot I want to talk about after you watch this incredible exchange.
Very good. Let's see, time now is 6:42. Let's go back to one of the other stories, much talk about at the moment. London's Metropolitan Police are considering whether a joke made by comedian Joe Brand amounts to an incitement to violence after she suggested people who throw milkshakes at politicians should use battery acid instead.
The comments which she made during a BBC Radio 4 comedy show have since been removed from a catch-up version of the programme. There's a lot of debate about whether they should have been broadcast in the first place. Let's discuss this now with comedian Konstantin Kisin, who joins us now from our London newsroom. Good morning to you. What do you make of this row about this joke?
Well, I can see why people are angry about it. I think one of the first things that needs to be said here is there's a tremendous double standard going on. As someone who's neither right nor left-wing, you can see that if this had been a right-wing comedian talking about a left-wing politician, say Diane Abbott, their career would be over by now. They would be ostracized. They would never be on television again. So I can see why people are angry. Having said that, the way you fix that double standard isn't by treating everybody equally badly. Jo Brand is a comedian. She was performing as part of a comedy talk show called Heresy, the point of which is that people take extreme positions for the purposes of humor, right? So you can expect that something controversial will be said. And if you start to live in a society where people get prosecuted or investigated for jokes, which is already happening, then you really know that that society is not really free anymore.
And I will just reflect, because Nigel Farage has commented, he's given an interview to the Sun newspaper and said, it's kind of reflecting what you said when you compared the joke that potentially could have been made about Diane Abbott. It's just because it was me. There are some, mostly on the left, who believe in the European project, to whom I'm the devil demon figure. So are politicians fair game? And if they are fair game, how far can you go as a comedian?
Well, this is the thing is, I don't think Jo Brand would argue that this is one of her best jokes. It's probably crossed the line. But the point for us as comedians is we don't always know what's crossed the line or what's funny or what's not funny until we've said it. And I'm a bit disappointed with Nigel Farage on this one, because he's usually someone who stands up for free speech. I think this is an issue where people need to ignore the party political side of this and just say, look, if we have a society in which comedians start to get investigated by the police for jokes that they tell, we're not really living in a free society. But I think an interesting point here as well is in terms of the BBC itself. It seems to me that the BBC has been very heavily focused on the diversity agenda recently, which is a good thing. But one of the things that doesn't seem to be reflected in the diversity is diversity of opinion. There's clearly nobody in that production room at this show who actually said, look, this might annoy half the country. And I think that's telling.
It certainly is. And you know why? Britain in the last few years has taken on an increasingly subjective definition for its exceptions to free speech, unlike the United States, where the exceptions to the First Amendment are clearly defined under things like defamation, incitement, or libel. And when that happens, comedians are one of the first people to feel the brunt. I think Konstantin, as a comedian himself, understands that because the particular joke that Jo Brand made fell under no such definition for exception if it had happened in the United States. By the way, do subscribe for important discussions like this. The truth is, the more subjective the exceptions, the broader that they can be applied. For example, here's what Section 4 of Britain's Public Order Act of 1986 says, that a person has crossed the line of free speech, and I quote, a person is guilty of an offense if he uses towards another person threatening, abusive, or insulting words or behavior, or distributes or displays to another person any writing, sign, or other visible representation which is threatening, abusive, or insulting. The word threatening makes sense because a threat can be qualified under certain legal parameters, but insulting? How does a legal system go about prosecuting an insult? The fact is it doesn't, and it leads to a justice and police system that finds itself in complete disarray at trying to enforce these highly subjective laws. More than 2,500 people in London were arrested over a span of 5 years for making offensive posts on social media, and while I'm sure some of them were genuinely threatening the safety of people online, you can't help but look at what's happening to comedians and think that a similar broad application of the law would be happening right here.
Well, the Prime Minister, Theresa May, her spokesman has said that the BBC should explain why the joke was, and I quote, appropriate content for broadcasters. She's waded into that. The Metropolitan Police has confirmed it's received and I quote, an allegation of incitement to violence that was reported to the Metropolitan Police on the 13th of June. Are you surprised it's gone that far?
I'm not surprised, actually, because this is something that I've been talking about for a long time. We have a creeping authoritarianism in this country. Actually, my debut show at the Edinburgh Fringe this year is about that. It's called All Well That Ends Well, because you might remember, your viewers might remember, about 6 months ago, I turned out a safe space behavioral contract from a university, which said that they had a zero-tolerance policy on racism, sexism, classism, ageism, ableism, homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, xenophobia, Islamophobia, anti-religion, anti-atheism, and demanded that all jokes must be respectful and kind. Right. So this is happening in society more broadly, and we're starting to see, I think, over 3,000 people were arrested in this country for things they said online, on Twitter, etc. So you're seeing people arrested and prosecuted and found guilty, frankly, and being fined for things that they say, for jokes that they try to make. So I'm not surprised, because a lot of us have been warning that this was coming.
What do you make? So the Sun newspaper is also reporting that Joe Brand was in front of an audience in Henley and said, looking back, it probably was somewhat a crass and ill-judged joke, something that you've alluded to as well, Konstantin, that might upset people. Of course, I'd never do anything like that. It was purely a fantasy. I'm sorry. I'm a human. I made mistakes. Is this the future for comedians? You know, make your joke, earn your living, but if you go too far, be prepared to say sorry.
Well, I hope not, and I'm glad that I think Jo has apologized, but I also think she's taken a pretty good stand on this in terms of, you know, not really apologizing fully, and I don't think she should apologize fully. I think the line that we have to hold here is to say that comedians have the right to joke and to make mistakes, and making mistakes is part of the process. So I think we have to. This is a point. I think it's a crucial moment, actually, in this country, for us to make a decision. Do we want to live in a society where you have free speech, or do you want to live in a society that has licensed speech, where what you're allowed to say is determined by the police, essentially?
Konstantin Kisin, thank you very much for talking to us on Breakfast this morning.
Can't help but agree. Comedians in a society almost act like a barometer for how much free expression a society tolerates, and for places like Canada or Britain, what's happening to comedy is certainly not a good sign. By the way, if you're wondering what the joke by Joe Brand that got so many people riled up, you'll realize that perhaps it did fall on the edge of what is considered to be in good comedic taste. Back in 2019, the British public had found a rather harmless but insulting way to protest their political candidates, which is to throw milkshakes on their suits if they walked out into the public. Now, I hate this, but that happened to conservative politician Nigel Farage by a man clearly on the far left that did not like what he stood for. Just watch this moment, as well as Joe Brand's remarks that sent people into a frenzy.
I don't know why. Take it away. Get him back to the car. Back to the car. Get him back to the car. Back to the car.
It's a complete failure. I spotted that about.
Well, yes, I would say that, but I think that's because certain unpleasant characters are being thrown to the fore, and they're very, very easy to hate. And I'm kind of thinking, why bother with a milkshake when you could get some battery acid? That's just me, and it's all right. I'm not going to do it. It's purely a fantasy, but I think milkshakes are pathetic. I honestly do.
That joke's a tricky one because it employs sarcasm. Someone that doesn't get the sarcasm in the battery acid part may find themselves wanting to actually carry out the attack, which could have landed Jo in trouble for incitement. But of course, she gave an important qualifier after the joke, and nothing of the sort happened.
It never happened.
It's also important to remember that this joke took place at the Heresy comedy show on BBC Radio, which is known for pushing the edge of dark comedy and being provocative with its style at times. That's perceived as what some may call a safe space for comedians that have an affinity for that type of humor. Despite that, not only did the show distance itself from her afterwards, but she was even investigated by police for the remarks. There were even calls for her to come out and officially apologize, which she did not do.
Morning.
Morning, Joe.
Might be afternoon, I'm not sure.
Do you have anything
Hi
to say
there.
in response to your critics?
I don't know. I think if they want an answer, there have been plenty of explanations by the BBC and Victoria Corrin as well.
Do you have anything to say to Nigel Farage?
No.
Are you going to carry on working with the BBC?
Well, I don't know what you mean about that,
Well, no,
because I'm
because
not
obviously-
employed by the BBC, so how can they sack me? Thanks a lot. Nice to talk to you.
Thank you.
Maybe that was ultimately a wise decision for the sake of comedy, and there's two reasons why. Every apology is a precedent, and she knew she wouldn't be setting a strong enough precedent to keep the space open for other comedians, since she knew the joke was meant to be exactly that. And secondly, an apology is an admission of what you're being saddled with, and that's not something that can do just to get out of a situation when people are already so keen to pounce on anyone that makes the slightest mistake. There's also another interesting angle to this that some people may have missed, and Nigel Farage himself drew a spotlight on this. It's that the liberal left are very quick to jump on anyone that falls out of line, even if in a comedic timing and setting, and it's leading to comedy overall moving more to the right, where it feels relatively more secure for them. When you look at that in totality, that's not a healthy sign, because ultimately we need comedians that can poke fun at all political sides and parties, not just one. Jo Brand was also one such comedian doing that on the left, and she quickly found herself stifled over a joke perceived to be in poor taste. But in doing all of that, perhaps she also realized that the modern left just does not afford comedians the same degree of creative freedom to be able to play around with jokes and hone their craft over time. That's ultimately a sad reflection on comedy, as well as the political arena at large.